It's so lovely to be with you. I'm going to talk to you, as Cameron said, about the power of diversity and how we win when we get it right. So the quote that you see on the screen right now is one of my favorite quotes, and it's by a man called William Sloane Coffin. William Sloane Coffin was a civil rights activist and a very good friend of Martin Luther King's. And what was interesting about Sloane Coffin is he came from one of the most privileged families on the East Coast of America, but decided to spend his life fighting for those that were less privileged than himself. And the quote is, "Diversity may be the hardest thing for a society to live with, and perhaps the most dangerous thing for a society to be without." And I think when we look at what's going on in our world right now, his words are as powerful today as when he uttered them over 60 years ago. So in my book, Diversify, I partnered with Oxford University, and we have a lot of up-to-date data on where we are with the various underrepresented groups and what the benefits are when we better integrate them into society and, of course, into our businesses and places of work. So I'm sure many of you in this room are just about old enough to know a few Dylan classics. And as he said, the times they are indeed a-changing. And this is a quote that I think is so important when we're talking about disrupting industries and doing things differently, by Dwight D. Eisenhower. "Neither a wise man nor a brave man lies down on the tracks of history to wait for the train of the future to run over him." The world is changing. And I think for many of you here who have invested globally, you saw what happened with the BRIC countries, and even in Ray Dalio's speech that we just heard there, he talks about the rise of India and China. But there's another part of the world that is also rising that I think you need to be very aware of, which is where my family are originally from, Africa. By 2030, over 40% of the world's youth will be African. That's going to mean something very different for your businesses, particularly for those of you that are investing in the beginning in companies that are B2C. So this is where inclusion becomes so important, because the world is changing. The whole paradigm of how things are run is going to be completely different. And I want to move us on to how we move to a point where inclusion just becomes the norm. And I want to talk about this man. This is a man that disrupted my industry. As Cameron said to you, I started out in television and I was on TV for many years before going behind the scenes. And this guy is called John Landgraf. And this is where allyship becomes so powerful in terms of one person being able to make a huge difference. So in 2016, the television industry magazine Variety did an overview of America's least diverse network. And John's network, FX, came at the bottom. Out of the 168 programs that they had produced that year, 0 were directed by women of color, and 88% were directed by white men. Now, what was interesting was what Landgraf did next. Instead of trying to somehow defend the network and make excuses, he instead held his hand up and said, "You know what, I hadn't even realized," and decided he was going to do something about it. Within a year, FX had gone from the least diverse network in America to the most. Now, I don't have time to go into how he did it, but he turned it around within a year. And what happened next was particularly interesting for his network. New shows such as Better Things, which was about female menopause, and Atlanta were created. These shows were not only critical successes, but also commercial successes, and gave FX the highest ratings that they had had in the network's history. And what John said was actually his biggest regret was that he hadn't done it earlier. What is the equivalent of that for your sector? What is the equivalent of that for what you do in terms of who you invest in and what entrepreneurs you decide to nurture and develop, and what territories that you also decide to go into? So this man that you see on the screen right now is Professor Tom Malone, and he is the founder of the Center for Collective Intelligence at MIT. And the reason why I want to talk to you about Tom's work is because Tom's work shows that this stuff isn't just nice to do. It's actually really good for business. because it works when you get it right. So what Tom and his team at MIT wanted to know was it possible to measure group intelligence in the same way that you could measure individual intelligence? And they found that yes, you could. So the next question became, well, was there a certain set of criteria that made collective intelligence much more likely? And they found that indeed there was. There were three. The first was the social perceptiveness of the group, i.e., could individuals in the group tell what was expected of them, and did they understand what the general direction of the team was? The second was really about the ease of conversation between the group. Could ideas be robustly debated, and did everybody feel that they had the agency to be able to contribute their ideas and that they would indeed be listened to? But the third was really interesting. The third was about the number of women in the team. What Tom and his team at MIT discovered was that actually, the more women you had in the team, the better the group performed. Now, that was not to say you needed more women than men, not at all. That was to say the closer you could get to gender parity, the better the group performed. The evidence was so clear, because what you had was diversity of thought, you had diversity of thinking, you had perspectives that perhaps wouldn't have been considered otherwise. And therefore, overall, the company as a whole and the team as a whole performed better. Now, what I would say to you all is, because before you're investing, you're always assessing risk and whether or not something is worth it and if it's going to give you the returns. But actually, what if you turn things on its head and decided that what you would normally look at as a potential risk, instead you looked at as an opportunity for something new? So I was with Muhammad Yunus a few years ago, just before COVID hit, and I was lucky enough to interview him on stage. It's not every day that you interview a Nobel Prize winner. And what he said was, old roads won't lead to new destinations. It's quite clear, isn't it? Keep doing things the same way, you're going to get the same results. And sometimes, in your case, the results are good. But just because you've been successful doing things a certain way doesn't mean you will always be successful doing things that way. It's always about being ready for change when that change is necessary. So I think a question that every leader needs to ask themselves is everyone in the room? And if everyone isn't in the room, why not? And what are you going to do about it? Now, this stuff isn't easy. If it was, everybody would be doing it. But when we truly understand the benefits, when we truly understand why it matters, it's worth going through that discomfort in order to get to the other side. So I will leave you with one quote. I have a slide that's gone, but it's a very good quote, and I'm going to try and remember it. But basically, what the quote is that diversity is the magic. It is actually the force of differentiation. And with that differentiation, that is how you ensure that you get to a new destination that we've never achieved, and actually a goal that we should all be working towards as humanity. So enjoy the rest of the summit, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you.